Welcome to our episode of Reach Minds, Thoughts for Your Life's Journey podcast. In today's show, we explore how vulnerability can be a doorway into connecting with our human fragility. This concept is often overlooked in ourselves and when working with leaders in organizations. How do we, as practitioners, acknowledge or indeed discuss human fragility when we see it in our clients and our leaders, particularly as a part of the change and transitional process where uncertainty and anxiety could be present? Today, I'm joined by Steve Hearsum, a consultant, supervisor, and coach, and the author of No Silver Bullet, Bursting the Bubble of the Organisational Quick Fix, which examines how leaders and organisations unconsciously collude with the purveyors of quick fix, silver bullet solutions for complex challenges. Steve is a board member at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations and was formerly the co-chair of the Organisational Development Network Europe. Welcome, Steve.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for asking, Nita.
Lovely. I'm looking forward to our conversation today on human fragility, Steve. So let me kick off. How would you describe or define human fragility in a layperson's term?
What I'm struck by is how the word fragility isn't really used often, certainly in our work. What we tend to talk about is things such as vulnerability. And vulnerability, it's almost become something that organizations and people who work in development are happy with. It's comfortable. But it struck me during my work and my research and my writing that it didn't really express for me the full picture of my own experience of self and my own fragility when it comes to myself as a person, as a human being, and as a practitioner when I am at my most vulnerable or feeling vulnerable when I'm working with clients. The dictionary definition of fragility is something like the quality of being easily broken or damaged, or the quality of being delicate or vulnerable. But for me, fragility has a more evocative quality to it. It's this sense of easily damaged. When I think of my own fragility, I know that for me, there's a qualitative difference between feeling vulnerable and feeling fragile. The former, it has a quality of rawness to it. The latter has a quality of brittleness to it, that I might actually break, that I'm so fragile that I'm at risk of collapse. And I'll give you a very clear example of this. In the last couple of years, I had various things going on in my non-work life that meant that when I was asked to do some work with a new pan-European leadership team that was going to be based in the UK, I found myself creating the scenario where I could artfully and elegantly withdraw from doing the work and remove myself from the running. Whilst I'm quite comfortable with the possibility and the likelihood that there's been moments working with senior leaders when I might feel stuff, I knew I was too fragile to actually do that work at that moment. I was too brittle. So there's something for me here about brittleness and breakability that is evoked by the word fragile.
So were you, in that example, Steve, able to share your fragility with your client?
No, because in that context, it was a possible piece of work through another party who'd asked me if I was interested in doing it. So I hadn't got to the stage of direct contact with the client. And I knew that the next stage would have been conversation with the client. And it felt to me more ethical to end that engagement and even the possibility of doing the work before I got anywhere near contact with the client. It would have been a waste of their time and mine. I knew that.
Okay, so just circling back to your first answer around why organizations don't maybe embrace fragility. I'm curious as to what might be some of the reasons underlining that, do you think?
Top of the list would be some of the archetypes and the narratives that still exist when it comes to leadership. And we're still in thrall to heroic leadership, arguably servant leadership and transformational leadership and those types of things, in some senses, still have the taste of heroism about them. somebody who is so self-sacrificing that they serve others. There's still an inverted heroism there. So there's our archetypes and our narratives of leadership, the archetypes of great leaders as well. We still expect leaders to be fast, decisive, confident, heroic, charismatic. Well, that's the antithesis of somebody who's fragile or exhibits any kind of brittleness. We're not allowing others or ourselves to be like that. And then you can underpin that or add to that rather some other things. There's the broader expectations of leaders, of followers, of stakeholders, of shareholders that necessitates a lot of weight is put on clarity, on certainty and coherence. Again, the antithesis of any notion of fragility or vulnerability. Pace. We expect people to work at high speed. That doesn't really do much for you if you're actually feeling a bit wobbly. Add to that, I'd argue there's also a certain laziness here because bluntly, it's too not much like hard work and too uncomfortable to stop and think about how we might be feeling in a given moment, to entertain the possibility that we might need to take care of ourselves. And then there's a broad soup of things like fear and anxiety of failure, the inability to cope with not knowing. All of these things create a soup of a need for certainty. That means that if you entertain the possibility that you're more vulnerable and fragile, that cuts right against this drive for certainty that organizations have.
I guess what you're, in a nutshell, saying is that perhaps in the systemic environment, there isn't maybe an allowance or a space for fragility to unfold, and there may be pressure even from within the environment that you've got to show up in a certain way. You
Well,
can't say, I'm
yeah,
not managing.
I think we need to look at this in a wider social and political context. I had to stop myself laughing out loud on the one hand and wanting to bang my head very hard against a brick wall when I saw footage of American presenters on Fox and American politicians arguing that to vote Democrat was not something that a real man would do. That, and there you have, to me, that's an extreme example, though, of ways of thinking about difference and thinking about how we need to be that leave no room for the possibility that we might be something other than strong, resolute, confident, heroic, manly. And actually embedded or underpinning that particular form of misogyny, because that's what it is a laziness and a stereotyping.
And if you were to unpack that laziness and stereotype, what would that be? Laziness against what?
Because it's a lot easier to take a fixed binary position and set somebody up as the other and as plain wrong than entertain the possibility that things might be a little bit more complicated than they at first appear. Public discourse, and I would argue organisational discourse, is increasingly predicated on the assumption that we need to have a very clear idea of what we think and what you think, and that there is a right and a wrong, and that we are activists for something and we're against something else. I don't hear much room for conversations about ambivalence and nuance. There was a really good Radio 4 programme about 3 or 4 years ago, which was one of the best half an hours you could possibly hope to have with a radio programme, which talked about why is it we no longer are able to be ambivalent about things. Personally, I'm ambivalent about a lot of things. I
Yes,
actually really
yes.
like my ambivalence, but it's not a very popular position to hold.
And I guess it's when you're aiming for that, there isn't any space for fragility.
We also not mentioned the other thing here, which is really important, is that the moment you start to entertain the possibility that you're not as strong as you might wish to be, and particularly in the context of organizations, you might have to contend with your shame.
Absolutely. That was my next question
You
is
know,
what's the relationship between fragility and shame?
to me that they're intrinsically linked. And I want to backtrack. I think they can be intrinsically linked. I don't think they always are. I think for me, fragility can be an experience of feeling profoundly depleted. I may not be feeling shame at that, but I may be fully aware that I'm just so run down and conked out and I've had so much going on. And there's no shame in that. It's just stop the world. I want to get off. It's not the same as a fragility that is coloured by this sense of shame at something that you believe is wrong about yourself.
That's quite an interesting sort of constant. They're very different, aren't they? In some ways, it's almost like one is more around perhaps when you're feeling fragility, it's about the context you're in. And the other, as you describe fragility with shame, could be about that something that emerges from your own belief system that says, I must be strong, I must
Hmm.
be strong, be perfect, drive things. Is that what you're
Yeah,
trying to
that
say
is,
there?
yeah, and there's get a few psychoanalysts and people who work in psychodynamics together, and I'm sure they'll have a useful bun fight about the correct definition of shame. And the definition I quite is the difference between shame and embarrassment. Is embarrassment is your feelings and judgments around something you've done that you believe is wrong, whereas shame is you believe there's something wrong with you. And as a loose definition, that kind of works for me. But I think it's entirely I think what gets evoked, or the shame that can get evoked around fragility, is that tipping point when somebody is depleted, brittle, and shame can be evoked then by others' responses to that.
Yeah. It is interesting because we did do a podcast on shame, and one of the things I learned that shame can also occur when we're going through a learning process as well. It's a part of the learning process that
Yeah,
shame can be evoked as well. And I guess when you're a CEO or a leader and you're working on something and you might be out of your depth, then it's a learning process. Shame can be evoked in that context.
totally. But again, it goes back to how much permission and protection is there for senior leaders to even admit that they are wrong, let alone experience shame. And one of the stories in my book, in fact, there's a couple that really reveal shame within the C-suite, how senior leaders would rather write off, in one instance, $600 million than engage in a conversation about what one might learn from the mistakes that have gone on. In another case, a CEO taking 3 years to acknowledge to a consultant they've been working with who they'd expelled without ever talking to them, to reach the point of saying, I owe you an apology.
Wow.
There's so much pressure on senior leaders to perform and be a particular way that the possibility or the permission to say, I've got things wrong is rare, which is why the average tenure of an NHS CEO has been declining for years.
Oh, okay.
There's not, there's very, what you don't hear when it comes to senior leaders, and whilst it's entirely right that senior leaders are held accountable, and so government ministers are held accountable, I'd quite like it if I heard more stories of a CEO saying, I've got that wrong. And I did hear a story of this recently. Very big UK company that shall remain nameless and that I did work with. And I had a story told to me by one of their directors and execs who'd recently left that the CEO, in front of everybody to the entire organization, said, the approach that we took to change was wrong. I was wrong.
Wow. That's pretty brave and courageous to do
Yeah.
that, I think.
And that's rare.
Absolutely. I think that is rare. So, and it sounds to me that one of your terms, and I know that we've spoken often around using self as an instrument and building on your example just now, how can we use ourselves as an instrument to acknowledge our own fragility and take action on it?
My view on the whole self as instrument thing has shifted slightly. So I've gone from a place of thinking that self as instrument is really useful and really important, which it is, and then holding in mind that it's largely associated with Mian Chung Judge's work, certainly within the context of organizational development. But I'll say it's judgment. I own my judgment here, is that what gets missed is that Mian was somebody who was quite familiar with and open about her shadow side and could be quite grumpy and knew that she could be quite difficult to get on with. And therefore, she had an awareness of her shadow. And that was part of herself as an instrument. And to work with yourself as an instrument, you need to work with that as well.
Mm.
And my own story is that some of the stuff when we talk about self as an instrument, that gets denied and gets edited out. So if you're going to really use yourself as an instrument, for me, that means that ultimately you are prepared to really inquire into your own shit. And I use the word very deliberately, that you need to have a willingness to get curious about why you do sharp on some days as a total pain in the bum, or you are grumpy, or you are stroppy, or why you do suddenly want to run a million miles away when a client behaves in a particular way. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. I have a good friend and colleague who's in her 40s, and I was working with her last year. And she's highly attuned to her own anxiety. And she said to me, do you know what, Steve? It's taken me to my mid 40s to realize that sometimes the anxiety I'm feeling might not be my own. It might be somebody else's. That is self as instrument. The ability to notice that you've got this high level of this valency for anxiety and to feel it in yourself, and to have the reflexivity and the awareness to go, wait a minute, this says something about me, but what if it connects to something else? And what might it be telling me about what is going on out there? And the inquiry that then results from that. That is self as instrument.
That's a very powerful example and one I can really resonate with. So just circling back to your own experience that you shared around your own fragility, what tips and insights could you give somebody who's listening to this podcast, who works as a consultant, or a coach?
Oof.
There's a checklist I'm looking for here.
I know. Yes.
No, I'm not.
No. Well, paradoxically, that there is no silver bullet to this, as you'd expect me to say.
Yes.
But equally, there are what I would suggest are things that it is useful to attend to. I don't know. For some of the things that I would tend to look to. Where am I going to start? The top of the list for me is you need to develop your own reflexivity. And I make the distinction here between reflexivity and critical reflection. It's no good developing the skills of being critical reflective and going away for a weekend retreat and gazing at your navel and realizing that everything that's gone on through the year is to do with your relationship with your mother or father, then going back to work on Monday and not experimenting with what you've learned. So the reflexivity is what you are going to go and do out in the world from what you've reflected on, and then come back and then chew on that again, and so on and so forth. So developing your reflexivity is absolutely, I would argue, top of the list. I think one of the other things that is implicit in this, and this is what I make no bones about it, I find myself increasingly existentialist in my position on this stuff, which is the ask is to get more comfortable with not knowing.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's even possible to get totally comfortable with it, but not only not knowing, but having nowhere near as much control as we wish we had or think we have. And to get in touch with that, you just need to think about what's going on in the Middle East, for example, or global warming, stuff like that, how little control we have, and how do you get comfortable with that? There is something that I talk about in the book where I talk about owning our fragility, not pretending it doesn't exist, but actually getting curious about why we have this experience of ourselves, like my colleague did with her anxiety. Why am I feeling this? What does that tell me about me? And then doing more and more of this, inquire and inquire some more. And all of that in turn requires both courage and curiosity. I already touched on the thing about nuance and ambivalence. I think it requires being mentally able to notice your own propensity to take a fixed position. So the more I think that I'm right about something, I find myself catching that and going, why am I so certain? What am I missing here? So what's the nuance I might be missing? So getting really curious about your certainty. So those are those kinds of things, all underpinned by a willingness to experiment, because nothing is going to change unless you experiment. So that's that kind of rough and ready. I don't know how many things there are there, 7 or 8, but that's the kind of rough and ready list of things that I would probably suggest that one could usefully attend to. The last bit that I'd add to this is it helps if you can cultivate a sense of your own absurdity. If you've ever read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning,
yes,
if I remember correctly, the people he said survived the concentration camps were the people who, one, could cultivate some sense of purpose,
yes,
and two, could find humour in even the darkest moments. If you cannot find humour and see the absurd in the blackness, then you're probably in trouble. And when I think about many of the things that I get my knickers in a twist about, and that people in organisations get their knickers in a twist about, if we look at them through an existentialist lens, or even through the lens of what's going on in the wider world, they are the definition of absurdity. I'm worrying about that? Really? Really? It's literally absurd. I don't mean it in an unkind way. I mean it in a genuine, let's just see this for what it is in the context of the wider nature of what it means to be human.
You tell me, why is it that we don't do it?
too terrifying.
Because lurking under that is our human fragility, do you think?
Yeah, because if we go back to that thing I mentioned about US TV presenters saying that only real men would vote Republican, real men vote Democrat. You know, if you can't see the absurdity of your position in that, it must be terrifying or the terror underneath that you're so scared of women and difference that you have to discount them and marginalize them in that way. God, what are you so scared of?
True.
You must be really terrifying, Nita.
I'm not actually, but I could see some people. Steve, this has been a very provocative podcast for me, and it certainly is making me think about being more observed about things. If you enjoy listening, tell a friend.